Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to Islam 21C. Now, with our expert panel, we've been discussing the issue of the role of the masjid in the UK. And before the break, we established that there is a greater role for the masjid to play in society. This was established both in the Quran and the Sunnah, and both historically and sociologically, of course. Now, we're going to take the discussion forward, inshallah, and look at some of the problems that masjids in the UK have in opening themselves up. Asif, I want to turn to you and I want to ask, isn't one of the reasons why masjids don't want to open themselves up is because there's a very real uncomfortability in trying to engage, because then what you end up getting is confrontation, disagreement within communities about what direction a masjid take. So they feel it's too difficult to open the doors of the masjid to other activities.
Firstly, I'd like to echo what Murtada said previously before the break, in that many of the masajid that have been established, this is a great ni'mah or great blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we should not overlook the effort that was put in establishing these masajid. Alhamdulillah, we're living in United Kingdom and it's a very unique place where we have so many masajid. And we should be praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this. But it's out of our concern and the fact that we want khair, we want goodness for these masajid to progress, that we're having this discussion. So it's not a means of scorning or unnecessarily speaking ill about the stumbling blocks in making it into better masajid. As regards to your question, then I feel as though that the committee members or those who have established the masjids or those who are running the masjids, they have a very narrow way of looking at al-Islam, and they are looking at establishing mosques simply for the purpose of just praying in it and establishing the Taraweeh prayers during the month of Ramadan and perhaps other events that they may do. And they're very close towards this because, as you correctly said, there's a type of uncomfortability. This is still the first generation. You must understand that the ones who are running the mosques today, majority of them are first generation. And so this concept of tolerance of other cultures, being open and so on and so forth, this is of course going to emanate from their mindset, because they don't want to lose their culture. They are wanting to hold on to their culture. And I'm sure that as generations pass, that some of the mosques, inshallah, they'll be more open towards other cultures, allowing people from other groups and other cultures to join the masjid as part of the committee and to engage with the wider community. But I feel as though this is happening, or the reason why some of the masajid are being a bit closed-minded, because they almost feel as though their culture or their understanding of Islam is being threatened.
Murtaza, looking at the role of the masjid, I know the panelists all are in agreement that it is a great thing to be establishing the prayer. But isn't that opening the masjid by establishing the prayer and Taraweeh? Isn't that opening an avenue for the community to join together? Isn't that enough, or is it need to go more forward? And what is the problem with just keeping it with those roles?
Of course, there is incredible benefit for praying in Jama'ah, for praying Taraweeh together. There is, but more can be done. If people may be getting reward, but if they don't afterwards know each other, if they don't know each other's names, if they don't know anything about each other, how will they become friends? How will they help each other? How will they be there for each other when they need each other? How will they discuss issues which affect the community? If this dialogue and this community interaction does not happen, then you cannot really get towards closer to the idea of the ummah. You cannot get closer to the idea of one body working together, in sync with each part doing its own job. You cannot do this if you don't do more than pray.
And would you agree with Asif that it's this closed-minded nature of what the masjid should be is causing the problem as why the masjid doors are not opening?
I think any discussion like this should always begin with how Asif began it, which is that we should respect what has been achieved. And you have to realize that it is that virtue of establishing masjid that has actually being a limitation to it, because it was established to do the bare minimum. Because at that time, you know, the first generation has to suffer from racism. They have to suffer from economic difficulties. So for them, it was essential to establish or to begin doing the essential parts of their deen. And that's what they did. But that's where they stopped. And that's where they have had difficulty progressing from. So there's two sides to the coin. And we have to give both of them equal weight, I think.
Racism having to deal with immigration, I mean, are these the reasons why these masjids just had a singular view of what the masjid should be, or is there something greater at work here as to why these doors are not opening?
I think there is something greater. I think it's fair enough to, an initial analysis may well sort of suggest that the fact that they were immigrants, the first generation, as Asif suggested, meant that they were very protective. But the irony, of course, is that if that were the case, if that were merely, that was the sort of dominant factor, the irony, of course, is that in setting up a masjid, and allowing the masjid to do multiple activities, they would have enabled themselves much more. For instance, if in the beginning English classes were to be held in the masjid, for example, would have brought the community much more together. So in fact, while the argument seems to sort of be coherent, such that they were immigrants and therefore they were protecting only, you know, the most important things to themselves, I think that argument is valid. But I think that is not the only picture, that is not the only way to look at this. I think the sort of certain parochialism that sort of entered the Muslim mindset, whereby we only look at things in a very narrowed way, and the mosque being a good metaphor of that, is the fact that hospices, treasuries, all of these functions that the mosques perhaps at a particular point in time used to perform, started being performed by other agencies of the state in the Muslim lands. So that slowly what happened was that the idea of the mosque was emptied, in kind of almost following the emptiness that we started our discussion with, that the idea of the mosque was emptied, and the only thing left over, if you like, in some senses, was the salah. And that became emblematic of the mosque. And so I think, in some respects, it is the Muslims, the diaspora Muslims in the West and other places, that may be able to reinvigorate the idea of the masjid, because we perhaps need it in a way that people in the Muslim lands perhaps don't, because they have the institutions that otherwise, although I think that's not, I don't wholly agree to that, I'm just putting it forward as a suggestion. I do think, however, that the Muslims in the diaspora perhaps are well placed to reinvigorate the idea of the mosque.
But I think that the fundamental factor in the way that the masajid are like how they are is their understanding of the role of the masjid. Because as you said, that, you know, it would have been excellent and it would have been very progressive for the community to come together if they had English classes and so on and so forth. But they would consider these matters to be very dunyawi, very worldly, and they've actually separated this from the role that the masjid can actually partake in. And there are some ahadith that, you know, they may use. Example, you are not allowed to announce in the masjid if something's been lost. You can't say, come into the masjid and say, okay, I've lost this. Can someone tell me, you know, if they find it, come and contact me? And they used, you know, they perhaps may use a hadith such as this to show that there is a difference, that the mosque is only for deeni issues, only for religious issues, and nothing to do with the world. So I think the fundamental issue is the understanding that the people have with respect to the role of the masjid.
I mean, what would you say to that? Because there are, as you say, a hadith like, I mean, you can't buy and sell in the masjid. As you say, you can't announce lost items in the masjid. There is clearly that distinction. I mean, how would you address that?
Well, it's addressed by not looking at just one or two evidences. You have to look at all of the evidences. You have to look at what the masjid represented for the Muslims at that time. There were many examples where they were discussing matters of the dunya. You know, the Prophet ﷺ, he was asking the Sahaba about their dreams. This is nothing to do with the deen. He used to distribute money in the masjid, the booty, the war booty that would come as a result of a successful jihad or so on and so forth. This was distributed in the masjid. Sa'ad ibn Mu'adh radiallahu anhu, as I said earlier, he was treated in the masjid. So the masjid is not limited to just deeni or religious issues. It's beyond that as well. So we can incorporate other things. Perhaps we'll discuss this in more detail on what we can do in order to...
Yes, we will get into that. Murtaza, let me turn to you. I mean, looking at the history of the UK as well, we've obviously seen a rise in multiculturalism and liberalism in allowing different communities to express themselves. Would you say this has also contributed to a more flagrant understanding or more outward reach of the masjids as well, because now the society in general is more open? Because as you say, racism was a factor that kept it quite insular, and now as we see society move forward in general, so too with the masjids?
I think this is definitely an obstacle towards the development of the masjid as a meeting place. And this is an issue that we touched on earlier, that we haven't really explored in great depth, and that is the individual culture of each ethnic or linguistic group that exists in this country as immigrants, and how that affects their religious practice. Because a lot of the religious practice it's sort of mixed or with culture and with religion. So many of them perhaps don't even see an additional aspect to the deen apart from praying. And then the multicultural aspect also raises issues in that mosques become dominated by a certain ethnic group, whether deliberately or inadvertently. And this is something we really have to look into deeper as a serious obstacle to development.
Definitely, and that issue of one culture, monoculture masjids is something that we're going to take after the break. Do join us for more discussion on these issues. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.